by around 2 months after giving birth are expected to be just, quote, back to normal. When the truth is, as many of us who have given birth know that there is no going back to normal. Once you are a parent forever. Welcome to the Coffee Witching Hour. My name is Lacey, and this is my new podcast that is all about raising kind humans, birth, babies, yoga, all of those things. So today we are going to talk about a topic that I love. We're going to be getting into my postpartum journey, and I'm going to be kind of telling you about my two different experiences, but I'm also going to be sharing what worked for me postpartum and what I would have done differently. Even though I am a birth doula and postpartum doula and knew a lot of things before getting into the postpartum period, postpartum is such a powerful time of life because you are with a tiny, tiny human who is so dependent on you. The baby has come out of your body, but you and the baby in a lot of ways are still one. And often this process is happening not in isolation, but as part of a family unit or as part of a larger community. It's such a big teacher for how things begin to shift with you and your partner if you raise a child with a partner, because gender roles can be magnified during the postpartum period. Even if you feel like a relationship is very, very balanced before bringing a baby into the mix, once a baby is there, it just changes everything. Everything in the partnership is put on the table. Everything is now up for discussion again. Everything that you thought you were certain about is now a question. At least that's what I found in my experience, and that's what I hear from a lot of people I've talked to as well who have had babies. It's a huge, huge learning experience. And the postpartum journey is one that can be amazing. It can be such an incredible bonding experience, or it can be extremely exhausting and challenging. And for most people, it's both of those things together. Often what I hear leaning towards the more exhausting and challenging, but ideally, in an ideal situation, it's both of those things together. It is exhausting, challenging, but it is also beautiful. But the goal with every postpartum experience is not to make it an experience that is not challenging at all, because it's going to be a challenge when you bring a new human to the planet. But the overall goal is to have a feeling of being supported and have a feeling of being nourished by, hopefully by a partner and also by the larger community, which unfortunately is not the reality for most people, because we tend to live in isolation these days in our isolated bubbles, and people have to get back to work sometimes within days after giving birth, but usually by around 2 months after giving birth are expected to be just, quote, back to normal. When the truth is, as many of us who have given birth know that there is no going back to normal. Once you are a parent forever. Matrescence, the process of becoming a mother, it's just as much of a process as adolescence is in terms of the brain chemistry that's changing, the hormones that are shifting. It is a massive shift going from being one single person to suddenly being two. And so we need all of that support, and we need people who are not parents to understand. My own personal postpartum experiences were two completely opposite ones. It's going to be interesting for me to kind of dive into those details because I feel like I talk about my two birth experiences so often being a prenatal yoga teacher that I'm just like, yeah, one was a 29-hour labor. It was long and painful. The other was a pretty quick, non-traumatic, like 2-hour induction. And I feel like I've gone through the details of those experiences in my mind so many times because birth is such a powerful experience that we're expected to process, we're expected to think through. But postpartum is and can actually be just as traumatic. My postpartum experience with my first, I'll call her baby Snoopy on this podcast, happened during the pandemic, during the heat of the pandemic, during the actual lockdown period. So she was born in June of 2020, and we were living in Boston then. Most of the people I knew from Boston had left, and what was left there in Boston was just a very, very quiet city that was just so different from the past 7 years when I had been there. So after Snoopy was born, we brought her home. We had our dog. We got the dog to meet the baby, and instantly they were best friends. And we started our experience just in this bubble, I feel, of happiness and bliss and just love and admiration for this little teeny tiny human. Coming into our role as parents, I don't think either of us really knew what to expect. I certainly didn't. I did a lot of work before becoming a parent, kind of trying to work through all the trauma from my own childhood and all of my fears really about being a mother. I was really, really, really terrified that I would lose myself in motherhood because everything that I had known to that point was really that you had two options. Either you kept a career and did that full time, or you just became a mother and that was it. And I don't feel that I had very many role models to show me anything different from either being a career woman who had no time for her kids or being a stay-at-home mom. My own mom was a stay-at-home mom. Her mom was a stay-at-home mom. My dad's mom was also a stay-at-home mom. So really, I am the first generation of women in my family who does anything other than just being a stay-at-home mom. And to me, having a baby, that felt scary because I had this full-time yoga work that I had been doing, and I desperately wanted to keep that because I was so passionate about teaching yoga in Boston. And then suddenly with the pandemic, I within a week lost it all. All the studios went online, and there was kind of that transition time of online teaching where we were all trying to make it work financially, but inevitably could not. Because it's hard to be an online yoga teacher full time. It's hard to make a living off of that unless you're a yoga with Adrienne. So I went from being fully employed teaching a lot of yoga classes a week and being so satisfied with that and being so satisfied that I was just going to go back to doing that, but a scaled down schedule, maybe eventually building it up over time. And I was just happy with that possibility. But going from that to losing everything kind of put everything into question. So that month before Snoopy was born, I did a lot of deep listening to myself and to those fears that I had, that I didn't want to be a stay-at-home mom. That was the last thing I wanted to do. I saw how hard it was for my mom. I saw how hard it was for my dad's mom, and all of the stress and isolation that comes with staying home with the kids. I wanted nothing to do with that. But I think what I didn't know at the time was that I could be a stay-at-home mom and not feel isolated. That I could be a stay-at-home mom and find strength in community. That I could be a stay-at-home mom and have a beautiful, vibrant life, but all I knew was this one track that was playing in my mind. So when I had Snoopy, I was kind of in this space of accepting a lot of those fears that I had around motherhood, around the fear of not having work to go back to, and around the fear of really being a bad mom because I wanted to work and have a child. And those fears really became magnified about 2 or 3 months after she was born, when suddenly I started getting work again. I transitioned to working remotely from home doing global health work. I started working full-time for Partners in Health. So I was working 40 hours a week for them. And then I was doing global health contracts on top of that. So it was all research, work from home. And suddenly, when I started working again, I started feeling this just massive feeling of inadequacy, that all I was doing was working and was not paying any attention to Snoopy, who I felt needed me. Because eventually, with the Partners in Health work and with the contract work, all of this remote research and public health work just ended up escalating to like some weeks where I would work 60 hours a week. And it was only doable because my husband was also at home and he was still a PhD student, but it was really hard for him to do any lab work at that point. So he was playing a big caretaking role, and I think I felt a lot of insecurity around my role as a woman because he was playing the bigger caretaker role and I was being more of the breadwinner. So it really caused me to question everything. So that's kind of a big picture view. I struggled a lot with not knowing what to do with myself, whether I wanted to work, whether I didn't want to work, whether I wanted to work a little bit, whether I wanted to work a lot, not knowing that none of that really mattered. None of that really determined how good of a mom I could be. But that's a big thing that I struggled with Snoopy's postpartum. The other big struggle, I think, was just being in isolation and not having community support. Really being just the three of us and our dog all together and not having anyone around. And in a lot of ways, that was a struggle. And also in a lot of ways, that same struggle of being in isolation was a huge benefit, and it's one of the biggest things that I look back at as with a lot of fondness at this time, because I loved only being able to wake up to my baby and my husband and our dog. I loved our little nest of love and bonding, and I felt that those 2 months when I wasn't working and when I was just home with Snoopy and we were all home together in our quiet little nest were honestly some of the best months I've spent in Boston in my whole life. Even though there was a lot of challenge there still with Snoopy being born with cataracts in both eyes and needing to have this urgent surgery and all of the fear around that, but still having this really unique bonding experience that hopefully, if we don't get another pandemic again, that we'll never have again. Even though it was hard not having support, it was a really, really amazing experience too. So there's a lot of nuance to that. There's a lot of me wanting just physically to have extra hands, to hold the baby, to nurse the baby, to do things around the house, and to try to get back to work. I just wanted more of me, but more of other people who were within our bubble itself. But at the same time, just really appreciating the unique bonding experience that it was. With baby Oakleaf, I found a lot of the challenges that I experienced with him were the same, but then a lot of them were very different. Living in this post-pandemic world, we had support. We had my parents around. My mom stayed with us for the first 2 weeks, and then my husband's mom came within the first month as well, so we had a lot of people in and out of the house. Yeah, I had sessions with my doula who came, and then I had a cloth diapering session, and then my husband invited the neighbors over for dinner one time, and we had just a lot of people in and out of the house. That was, although we had more support, I would say that there was way less opportunity to bond with baby Oakleaf. And I don't want to say that if I would have done it again, I would have told everyone to leave, because that's not true. But I think I would have been a little bit more selective about who I allowed into my bubble. My mom was the greatest help. Those 2 weeks that she came to stay with us after baby Oakleaf was born, that was exactly what I needed, because my biggest fear going into baby Oakleaf being born was just inadequacy. I was so afraid that I would be inadequate of a mom again to 2 kids, because I felt like I had a pretty good handle on being a mom to baby Snowpea. But with a second kid in the mix, I didn't know how I was going to do it. And again, it felt like a big physical challenge to me. Like, how do you hold a crying baby, but then also do a diaper change for a toddler? How do you do that at once? So I was incredibly worried about that. And my mom being there provided a lot of support for the toddler specifically. So she spent a lot of time with baby Snowpea while I got to bond with baby Oakleaf, and that was just great for me. Also, during those 2 weeks, I had kind of this elaborate postpartum healing ritual that I really spent a lot of time thinking through during the prenatal period, because I had done postpartum doula trainings at that point and had read incredible postpartum books like The First 40 Days, which is a book that's all about nourishing the mother with soups and healing foods and all of that. And then I also read The Fourth Trimester by Kimberly Ann Johnson, which is all about the physical healing process during the postpartum period. So I was weaving in a lot that I had learned from my doula training into this postpartum healing within those first 2 weeks especially. I was doing these sitz baths with local herbs, and I was doing Abhyanga, which is a warm oil massage, and I was eating soup every day, and I was just really, I don't know, I just felt like I was in this healing bubble, this like bubble of self-care and support. And then suddenly, after those 2 weeks were up and after my mom had left, I felt so alone. I felt like all of those feelings of fear crept back up on me, and suddenly I felt like it was so hard to take care of 2 kids at once. 2 weeks passed and it got a little better. It was extremely hard for those like 2 to 4 weeks, that range, because not only was I taking care of those 2 full time, but also we spent some time in the pediatric ICU because baby Oakleaf ended up getting a fever, and if you are a 2-week-old baby with a fever, they send you straight to the ER. So we had to spend a couple of days there. So we were in the hospital, in and out of the hospital. He ended up being just fine. They wanted to do all kinds of exams on him. They wanted to do a lumbar puncture and all of this stuff, but we were very confident that he had a fever because we were all sick with a cold. So again, another kind of negative thing about being around so many people during the postpartum period. Ava ended up going to the library with my mom, and I'm guessing that's probably how she brought home whatever the RSV. It was RSV that he had, so it's probably how she brought home RSV from the other kids at the library. So being exposed to other people got us into the ER. So that was pretty hard. And then on top of that, my husband had just started working for a startup. He left academia when we moved here to St. Louis to go into venture capital. The ultimate goal of venture capital being to join a company here in St. Louis. And right after giving birth, he decided to join a startup, which was not the greatest time. He was working long hours, and I was just kind of there with the kids, tired, exhausted, frustrated, wanting more support, not being able to ask for more support. And then my husband impulse bought a puppy. So he was working at a startup, and then he decided to buy a puppy because he thought our older dog Blue was lonely and kind of like a little child. He was like, oh, I'm going to take care of the puppy. I'm going to clean up after it. This is going to be my dog. You have the baby. This is my baby. But being in a startup 24/7, or what it felt like, kind of left me with a tiny puppy to care for in addition to 2 small humans. That was kind of a very messy experience. Literally a very messy experience. So then on top of all of that, my husband's side of the family came to visit for a little bit, which was a challenging dynamic. It was around the 4-week mark when they came to visit, and I think I had just kind of started getting into a little bit of a routine with the 2 kids, despite having a puppy thrown into the mix, despite having my husband's schedule thrown off with being in a startup, despite having spent some time in the pediatric ICU. I've kind of felt like we were just starting to get into things, and then it felt like it suddenly got derailed by the arrival of the in-laws. And I'm gonna have a really hard time finding the right words here to express how that was, but I think a lot of it was that as a child, I saw the tension between my mom and my dad's mom kind of blow up to extreme proportions whenever we would go to visit his family. And it really ultimately just came down to differences in parenting. My grandma was very strict and my mom was not so strict. And my grandma just didn't like the way my mom parented us. We were a little bit too American for her standards. She was English, and things were just done a little bit differently there. She didn't like us snacking between meals. She didn't like us looking a mess. She didn't like us being too loud. She didn't like us taking up too much space, essentially. And so I saw a lot of my mom's struggles to stand up for us kids, to protect us kids, and to protect herself against my dad's mom when they argued all the time. So I kind of came into this experience knowing that it can be a struggle interacting with in-laws, and that's kind of what happened with us. With my parents growing up, it always felt like my dad was kind of put in the middle, and that he had to both defend his mom and his wife, and it often felt like both of them were trying to get him to choose one side, and he could not. And it was so stressful for him. My situation was a little bit different in some ways, and it was similar in some ways as well. There were cultural differences that were pretty big. Daniel's mom being culturally Mexican, me being culturally American. Just differences in how she parented versus how I parented, and her wanting to step in and say, hey, it'll be easier if you do it my way, and me wanting to be polite and be respectful and also be like, yeah, but I know what works for me and this is my way of doing it, without butting heads with her. So there was a lot of that happened within the week that she was there, and it really put a lot of insecurity into my ability to parent 2 children, because now thrown into the mix was all of this doubt from the situation with her being here, but also from my husband, who, with her around, wanting to express his gratitude and appreciation and all of that, kept saying things like, oh, I wish you could cook like her, I wish you could clean like her, la la la, all those things. So that kind of got into my head as well. All of this, plus the fact that we had literally just moved to St. Louis, although we had my parents nearby, 2 hours away, so it wasn't just right next door, but although we had my parents nearby, and although St. Louis is close to where I grew up, I felt I was still lacking in support. So overall, second baby postpartum experience was really, really challenging for me compared to the first, I think. All of this brought back those fears that I was experiencing way back when, way back before I had even given birth to Snoopy, where I was just afraid that I couldn't have it all, that I couldn't have a career and be a mom. And I felt that although I was just staying home at that point with 2 kids during Oakleaf's postpartum experience, that I was still so inadequate because I couldn't cook, because I couldn't clean, because I was struggling to take care of 2 kids in this big house that we live in, and because I wanted more help, and because I was asking my husband for more help, even though he had a demanding schedule. So all of those feelings of inadequacy came up once again, and I kind of started spiraling into this cycle of self-doubt, like, oh, if I can't even be a stay-at-home mom, if I'm not even good at that, then what am I good at? And it magnified those gender roles that I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast between my husband and I. Whereas with Snowpe's postpartum experience, I was doing more of the work outside of the home, the productive work, and he was doing a lot of caretaking in the early months after I started working for Partners in Health. With this experience, when I was completely at home and when he was working this demanding schedule, it really felt like our relationship regressed in a lot of ways. Regressed to this 1950s housewife and American dad experience where I felt pressured to just be this perfect housewife. And I felt that I was actually starting to lose myself. And I felt like those fears that I would be a stay-at-home mom and be isolated and be incredibly anxious and be alone and feel deprived were just beginning to manifest themselves. And that's when I knew something had to change. So from that postpartum experience and from that experience of self-doubt and that experience of our roles regressing to being this American dream 1950s housewife situation, and my feeling that something was just not right in our dynamic, in our relationship, in this entire lie that it felt that we created, this lie that we were living the American dream when it was in reality just so hard. I felt something had to change. So that's when I started just saying no, started really just advocating for myself and for my needs within our relationship. That's when I started saying, I need some space for myself too. I cannot be the 24/7 caretaker. That's when I started working again. And that's when I started getting the itch to write again. And that's when I started saying, I love my kids and I am good enough at doing this. And I am not a perfect housewife. That's when I started saying, I need something other than just being a mom. I love being a mom. And yet, I am also a powerful writer. And yet, I am also a powerful yoga teacher and a researcher and all of these many hats that I wear. And that even though I'm struggling to fold all of our laundry and to cook dinner and to do these things that I felt should be very basic, but that I was struggling to get done, that maybe that's because things should have been more equal. The work should have been distributed more equally. And that maybe being a housewife just wasn't my calling. And that maybe I just needed to get my butt back into the real world and start contributing in the ways that I knew my soul was itching to contribute. So really, that's where writing the book started. That's where filming yoga classes again started. That's where teaching yoga in St. Louis started. That's where doing doula work started. That's where doing some part-time research started. That's where this podcast started. It all started from those seeds that were planted in that postpartum journey about a year ago. And it's only been a year since then, and so much has shifted. I'm still with the kids, being their kind of day-to-day caretaker, but almost every evening I'm now working outside of the home. And although our dynamic, my husband and I, is far from perfect, I no longer feel like a 1950s housewife, and I think if anything, that is progress. So if I had any piece of advice to give pregnant people who are about to have a baby, whether it is your first or your second, if I had any advice about the postpartum period, it would be to not just think through the fears around birth, around parenthood, around all of those things, but also talk them through with your partner. Talk through the gendered expectations and the expectations in general of caretaking, of work outside of the home. Talk through those things and be explicit about what is expected and negotiate, because it's never fair on one person person to be doing all of either A, the housework and caretaking, or B, have the financial load. That creates a very unequal power dynamic in the relationship. So talking through those things and also talking through how both partners are going to prioritize self-care, because both partners need space for self-care. And when I say self-care, I mean the things that fill your soul. Being around the little ones, of course, fills your soul, but everybody needs a break. Everyone does. So for me, just getting out of the house, going to a coffee shop, and writing for an hour, that is an incredibly powerful thing to recharge my soul. As is just sitting up here and doing this podcast, as is going out and teaching yoga. Those are things that are self-care to me. So talking through those things, and of course having a plan for all of the amazing healing postpartum things that I mentioned for my second baby, those are also amazing too. Making soups and having sitz baths and doing warm oil massage, all of those things of course are nice too. But the bottom line is that we cannot do it alone. No one should be doing all of the caretaking in isolation, and that we should be intentional about who we allow into our space. Not that family is not allowed, but that ultimately we have to be prepared for the uncomfortable messages that we might experience with extended family around, and that we have to be comfortable standing our ground and listening, knowing that we have strong instincts as a parent, that ultimately it's our opinion that matters, but also being receptive. So those are the things that I recommend. So if you're still with me at this point, thank you so much for listening. I really do value everyone who is listening to this podcast, and I really want to hear what you have to think as well. If you have had a baby already, please let me know how your postpartum experience went and what you would do differently as well. If you are pregnant and are going to have a baby soon, let me know what you're afraid of, and let me know what you're planning to make things less scary, how you're planning to take agency in your own postpartum experience. Please do, if you are watching on YouTube, like this video, subscribe. If you're listening on Spotify, please also subscribe and rate me 5 stars as well. I appreciate those ratings so much. I want to say thank you so much from the bottom of my heart again, and I will see you next time.